So the 2015 Iran nuclear deal has survived for more than 4 years, but only just. It was signed by Iran and 6 nations led by the U.S. under President Barack Obama in a deal to lift sanctions in exchange for monitoring of Tehran's nuclear activities. Less than a year later, President Donald Trump withdrew from the agreement and he reimposed sanctions. While other nations tried to keep the pact alive. But following another wave of tough U.S. sanctions in May last year, Iran began rolling back its compliance. First, it increased its stockpile of enriched uranium. And on Sunday, after the U.S. killing of its top military commander, Tehran suspended limits on uranium enrichment and nuclear research as well as development. Let's talk about this with Eli Guernmaya. She's a senior policy fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations. She's joining us via Skype from London. Thanks very much for your time with us on the Al Jazeera News Hour. So what role do you think the EU can actually play in mediating this crisis?
Well, the EU and some key countries in the European Union have a direct stake in the nuclear file with Iran. They are parties to the agreement that, as you mentioned, the United States withdrew from, and they have been trying their best to preserve at least the architecture of this agreement in place to prevent a nuclear crisis emerging in parallel to this military escalation that we're seeing between the US and Iran. I think a second area where there may be a European role to play is by actually playing a direct mediatory role between Washington and Tehran. The Europeans have direct access to both capitals. Some of the key figures in Europe, like President Macron, have had endless hours of phone calls with both Presidents Rouhani and President Trump over the past year, and they could play a strong role to creating this longer extended cooling off period between the two sides after this military escalation.
Right, but how much leverage? I understand what you're saying about the Europeans having a stake in this deal, but how much leverage do the Europeans actually have? Because the Iranians seem to criticize the Europeans, saying that they just haven't done enough to salvage this deal ever since the US president withdrew.
Look, I think there's no illusion in Europe that given the unpredictability surrounding President Trump's actions and strategy, that there's going to be there's not going to be a huge amount of leverage and influence that they can have in this game. But, let's not forget that Iran, at the same time as withdrawing from its commitments under the nuclear deal, has explicitly not withdrawn from the agreement altogether. It has left the door open for some sort of diplomatic initiative, particularly from the Europeans, who have a degree of influence with Washington to try and pull both sides out of this escalatory cycle that we see at the moment.
What about... Go ahead, please.
To a limited extent as well, the Europeans could have an economic role to play. Obviously, companies across Europe have taken a major setback because of US secondary sanctions. But there are still some creative works in the pipeline regarding how some degree of trade between Iran and Europe can continue regardless of the US sanctions architecture.
And let me ask you about the Iranians' step on Sunday, where they said they would no longer be abiding by limits set on how many centrifuges they can use to enrich uranium. Yet at the same time, the foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, said that the move was a remedial step and it is reversible. So are the Iranians themselves keeping the door open for diplomacy?
Certainly, I think they have made clear step after step that their actions are reversible as long as the other parties to the agreement can fulfill their parts of the commitment. So far, neither the Europeans nor, frankly, the Chinese or the Russians have been able to provide Iran with a substantive economic package that can compensate for the major hit that the Iranian economy has taken after the US brought back its sanctions. So that's one area. But I think the second area that we should be aware of is that everybody now is watching the clock tick up until the November elections in the United States. And I think one part of the strategy so far for the Europeans and the Iranians is to keep at least the shell of the nuclear deal in place until November, when I think everybody will have to make some critical decisions if they are in fact facing another 4 years of the Trump administration.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. We thank you very much for speaking to us from London.